Good afternoon, everyone. I think we're going to get underway. It seems like everybody has here and is getting their seats. I'm James Cusick. I am the curator for the P.K. Young Library of Florida History here at the libraries. And on behalf of myself and of Dean Judith Russell, who's Dean of University Libraries, I want to welcome you to the annual Michael Gannon Lecture. This is a lecture given in honor to one of the university's most beloved and distinguished professors of history, Michael Gannon. Also, on behalf of the Dean and the libraries, I want to welcome members of the Anthropology Department and the History Department and all the supporters of the Michael Gannon Lecture Endowment and thank them for their assistance in helping to make this lecture and previous lectures possible. I'm also very pleased to note the constant support of Gigi Hagen Gannon, who's Mike's wife and fellow adventurer through life and has been a real supporter of these lectures from the very beginning. The purpose of this annual lecture is to commemorate Professor Gannon's extraordinary career as a teacher, a mentor, voice of conscience for the University of Florida campus, voice of Florida history for students and the public. He was honored in St. Augustine as a constant scholar and speaker about the city's history. He was honored by King Juan Carlos I of Spain for his contributions to Spanish colonial history. He's a noted writer on the history of World War II. And he was a teacher of some 4 generations of students here at the university. His career is summarized in your program, and we hope you'll keep the program as a memento of this talk. And if at some point you want to help us to support the lecture, there is information about how you can do that on the back cover. We enjoy giving these lectures along with all the other things that the library brings to its event schedule every year, and we always appreciate support for it. I know too that Mike was very honored knowing that we would be holding these lectures, because he and I and Gigi talked about it during really the last year that he was with us. Each year we seek to provide new and enlightening research in areas that he really loved and exemplified, and especially in the history of Florida. This year, as in previous years, we have a wonderful and incredibly apt speaker for the lecture. George Aaron Broadwell is Elling Eide Professor of Anthropology here at the University of Florida and a faculty member of the departments of Anthropology and Linguistics. And prior to this, he was Professor of Anthropology at the State University of New York, Albany. His bachelor's degree is from Harvard. He has his master's and doctorate in linguistics from UCLA. He's a specialist in numerous languages, including Choctaw, Timucua, Zapotec, is it Capola Trique, and Seminole Creek. And he describes his principal field of study as that of endangered languages, primarily Native American languages of the United States and Mesoamerica. Professor Broadwell is the recipient of the 2023 Victor Gola Prize from the Society for the Study of the Indigenous Languages of the Americas. And among his many works are a Choctaw reference grammar, which I believe is actually out, our library copy is out on exhibit. Articles like Shadow Authors, the text of the earliest indigenous Florida writers, which appeared in Franciscans and American Indians in Pan-Borderlands Perspective, 2017. Also Legacies of Literacies, Fray Francisco Pareja and Timucuan Communities in Colonial Spanish Florida, which he published with Timothy Johnson, Flagler College. And that book's actually one of the ones that's for sale here today, and was also created and published in honor of Michael Gannon, so very appropriate to have it here. It's a new publication, 2024. And then finally, his new book, also 2024, The Timucuan Language, a Text-Based Reference Grammar. Broadwell also has created web-based dictionaries for numerous indigenous languages, and that includes Timucua, And the URLs or the ways to find those on the web are actually in your program. On a personal note, I would also just like to say how much I know Mike Gannon would have appreciated the scope of Professor Broadwell's achievements with Timucua. In one of his well-known lectures, The History of Florida in 40 Minutes, Mike always recited the Lord's Prayer in Timucua. I must have heard him do that at least 20 times. And we are fortunate in having the text of that and also having a recorded version of him giving that lecture still today. When he did that, Mike was relying heavily on the limited texts in Spanish and Timucua that we had available to us in the 1980s and 1990s. Professor Broadwell's amazing scholarship is rightly considered revolutionary. Not only has he discovered additional Timucua texts, but he has greatly expanded the ability to translate Timucua and laid the groundwork for understanding a language that has not been actively spoken for at least 250 years. As such, Professor Broadwell has restored a voice to people who lived under Spanish colonial rule in Florida and reveals what their writings say about the dramatic changes taking place in their lives and in the world from their own perspective. So I hope everyone will join me in giving an enthusiastic welcome to Professor Aaron Broadwell.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Jim. I appreciate it very much. It's an honor to be here today with you. I'll be talking about Timucua literature and the beginnings of understanding what's contained in that literature. And the plan of today's talk is first I'm going to start by acknowledging the land that we're on. I'll tell you a little bit about me and my trajectory. Then more generally about native languages in Florida, the variety of them. And then in particular about the Timucua language, how you can discover and translate it and work out its grammar. I'll talk about two kinds of Timucua text, and then I'll have some conclusions for you. And we'll have time for questions and answers at the end as well. So first, just to acknowledge the land. Where we are right now is the traditional territory of Timucua, Seminole, and other indigenous people who lived on this land and cared for it long before us. And may we honor their memory. Just a little bit about me. Jim introduced this, so I'll go quickly through it. I have various degrees in linguistics, and my graduate work was primarily on the Choctaw language, which is spoken in Mississippi on the reservation there. I continue to work with the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians. Right now we're working on a dictionary project for that tribe. So I've been working on that language for about 42 years. And so at this point, I know it pretty well. It turns out to be really valuable to know Choctaw if you want to study another native language of the Southeast, because there are many similarities. I was once professor at university at Albany, which is part of the SUNY system. At that point, I also worked on various Mexican and Guatemalan languages. I started to work on the Timucua data in the mid-1990s, but I looked over the material and I thought, this is too difficult. Nobody could figure this out. It's like a 10,000-piece jigsaw puzzle with no image of what the whole thing is supposed to look like. But then around 2010, there started to be some new developments in the kind of software that linguists use to analyze this data. And when I looked at it, I thought, you know, I actually think maybe I could do something with that Timucua language. If I had the right tools to help me find the right patterns in it, I could do something. And then I started to make pretty rapid progress after that, and I joined the department here in 2015. I'm the Elling Eide Professor of Anthropology, and this faculty position is endowed by the late Elling Eide, who was a great lover of Florida history, languages, and native languages. Okay. So just to tell you a little bit about native languages in the region, this is a map of native languages of the Southeast around 1600. So one thing that you always have to be aware of when you look at a map like this is looking at the boundaries and exactly where things are. So there was no Google Maps in 1600. Nobody actually went into the interior of the Southeast and worked out who was speaking which language where, right? So these maps are very approximate from the records left by early explorers and by various kinds of correspondence. This is our best guess at the distribution of languages in the Southeast about 400 years ago. The language that I'm going to focus on today is Timucua. That's the one you can see in this big sort of coral-covered part right here. But I'll also be talking about the Muskegean languages, which is this family right next to Timucua. And here's Choctaw, which is the language that I worked on for a long time. Okay, so just to say a little bit about Muskegean first, just to remind you, this big family here. It's the biggest native language family in the Southeast. It contains languages you've heard of and maybe some you haven't. Choctaw, Chickasaw, Alabama, Coasati, Miccosukee Creek are all still spoken. Appalachee was formerly spoken in western Florida, the area around Tallahassee. And here's another possible map of the distribution of Muskegean. Here's Appalachee spoken in western Florida. And these two languages here, Muskegean and Hitchiti, they're going to be important because speakers of those languages are going to be moving south into Florida during the period that we're talking about. So those two languages are the languages spoken by the modern Seminole Indians. They came into Florida in the 18th century from Georgia and Alabama. They may have been back and forth across the border much earlier. We're not quite sure. It may very well be that Timucua people were incorporated into the Seminole tribe at some time in the 18th century. We're not sure. There's a lot of darkness about that. Seminoles lived for about a century in the Gainesville area until the Seminole Wars and the Indian Removal Act. And now Florida Seminoles primarily live in South Florida around Lake Okeechobee, and they speak two Muskegean languages, Miccosukee and Creek. The Timucua people were originally located in northern Florida. Here's a map with a little bit more detail. We can see that there's a big area of North Florida, basically from the Atlantic to the Gulf, where Timucua people were primarily located. The coastal people around St. Augustine and Jacksonville were typically called the Mocama, and Mocama means coastal in the Timucua language. So these people were a very strong and important tribe at the time of Spanish contact, but they were allied with the Spanish, and they were Catholic, or many of them were Catholic. So there was constant tension between the Spanish Empire and the English Empire over the control of various kinds of territory in the southeastern U.S. And just north of where the Timucua would be the English and their native allies. There were a series of raids, wars. There were also pandemics and other sorts of terrible things that resulted in the eventual dissolution of this tribe. I say dissolution in that they no longer existed as a distinct tribal unit, but necessarily there were some descendants of these people. And exactly what happened to them is something we would like to know, and something that's a subject of modern scholarly inquiry. We think that the descendants probably are still alive in Florida and Cuba possibly, but Timucua no longer exist as a distinct tribal group. And although the Spanish called these people Timucua, we don't really know what they called themselves. Okay. So this language, how do we know anything about it? Well, there were two Franciscan priests here during the 17th century, Francisco Pareja and Gregorio de Movilla. And between the two of them, they were the masters of translating material into the Timucua language for the purposes of religious conversion. They published many religious texts in Timucua. There's an arte, which is like a Spanish grammar, short Latinate grammar, various catechisms, a confessional, a doctrina. There were also perhaps other materials that had been lost. These materials were published between 1612 and 1635, And so these are some of the earliest publication dates of Spanish colonial materials from the US. I'll also point out that colonial Florida did not actually have a printing press. So these manuscripts had to be written out by hand on paper and then sent via ship to Mexico, where they were printed in Mexico City, and then the books came back to Florida as a tool for conversion. A bit later in the 17th century, there are two letters written in the Timucua language by various political figures in the Timucua world protesting mistreatment by the Spanish. And my colleague Alejandro Dubkovsky and I have translated both of those letters recently. So all in all, there's about 2,000 pages of bilingual Timucua Spanish text, but how do you read this language? It's a big problem. By the way, here's an image of one of the letters written by a chief. This was the Jolata, or the chief Manuel, and you can see his signature there at the bottom of the letter. I quite like that. Istala just means I say it. It's not his name. Okay. So this language is what linguists call an isolate, meaning that it's not closely related to any other language spoken anywhere in the world. There were a few different dialects of this language. The most important were Potano, which was around here in Gainesville, the Mocama dialect out near Jacksonville, and then the Timucua dialect around the Florida-Georgia border west of here. When the Spanish came here, there was no writing system for this language. So they devised a way of writing the language using Spanish letters. We can't be sure if the alphabet captures all the sounds correctly, but because there are many different people who wrote it, we can compare many different ways of spelling the same word. That gives us a way of narrowing in on what likely pronunciations would have been. So we have a pretty good understanding of the sound system of this language. Timucua is related to another native language called Tawasa, which was recorded in Alabama. Unfortunately, this is a list of about 50 words in the Tawasa language written on the back of an envelope, more or less, by someone who's not a trained linguist. So it's hard to make much of that material, but there's enough there that you can see the two languages are related to each other. And beyond that, we don't know what Timucua might be related to. Some people have suggested Muskogean languages, some have suggested South American languages, but the jury is still out on that question. Okay, so how do you study this language? Well, there's not really any reliable dictionary of the language. At the time of the Spanish colonial period, Father Pareja tried to write an arte, a little grammar of the language. Here's a page from his handwritten grammar of the language. And you can see that in it he gives some words along with their Spanish translations. And luckily, from that, we have a little core of Timucua words translated into Spanish that we can be pretty sure about. There are about 400 words that have an explicit Spanish translation, but the text have at least 2,500 other words, and you have to figure these out from context. So in order to try to figure this out, when I got here about 10 years ago, I started working with various UF students to build databases for different native languages. Many thanks to students who helped me with that. We built a database that contains all of the available Timucua material, which is about 148,000 words. And based on that, we've created a draft dictionary, which is at the website that you see here, or the URL you see here. And because we don't want this material just to be accessible to professional linguists or something like that, we've also created a website called Hebwano.com. Hebwano is the Timucua word that means language or speech or word. And at this website, you'll find a lot of information about the language, some beginning lessons in it, some lessons on how to read Timucua letters and how to understand what the texts are saying. Okay. So before I go on, I just wanted to say a word about the general problem of the ethics of studying this language. So in my field, which is linguistics working with endangered languages, we've really had a lot of changes in what is considered ethical research. And these days, you can't really be a linguist who just decides to go work on some language, some native language. without gathering appropriate permissions. There's more and more a recognition that native languages are part of the cultural heritage of Native Americans. And when we deal with cultural heritage materials, we need to do appropriate consultations, get appropriate permissions. But how do you get appropriate permissions for a language like Timucua, where there's no longer any speakers and there's not a Timucua tribe? So around 2018, I taught a class on Timucua here at UF. And we had a lot of Native American students in the class. And we spent a fair amount of time talking about this issue. And we arrived at a principle that we're calling ethical curation for the future, which recognizes that there are almost certainly descendants of the Timucua. And in the future, those descendants are going to want to know and study their traditional language. So what we're trying to do in terms of dealing with this language is prepare it carefully and respectfully in such a way that people in the future will be able to use what we arrive at to understand their own language better. And for that reason, we're creating both technical, like grammars, and non-technical, like website things for the Timucua language. And we're also regularly consulting with the Seminole tribe of Florida, where many likely descendants probably live. Okay. So why is it possible to read this language now? There had been some attempts over the year to understand this language, the words, the grammatical rules, the text, but until about 15 years ago, there was very little progress. But there were a few things that made it possible to decipher the language. It's not exactly decipherment, but to read this unknown language. First is access to materials. So the books that contain Timucua language material, they're all rare books, kept in rare book rooms of libraries on several different continents. And until 20 years ago, if you wanted to study this language, you'd probably have to fly to Spain, and then you'd have to go to England, and then you'd have to go to Italy, then you'd have to go to Boston, and then go to Providence and New York and Washington, and maybe beg to make photocopies of these things, right? But they're all now available online, so someone who's interested in the language can actually get access to all the primary material. There's also been a great increase in computational power, so the kind of software that we use to help us find patterns has gotten better and more powerful, and that's invaluable to me. I've also had human support from several classes of hardworking students at UF who managed to transcribe all the data over a period of about 4 years. And I've also been fortunate to be able to collaborate with a lot of other scholars, especially historians, who help me understand and interpret these texts. So, having said that about the language, what do the texts actually say? If you're not a linguist, why would you be interested in what they say? Well, most of these items are religious materials. They were created under the direction of Franciscans. But the Timucua texts are rarely simple translations of Spanish or other European materials. Instead, the Timucua texts often add or omit information relative to the Spanish text. So in the talk today, I'm going to talk about two genres of Timucua literature and what they can tell us. There are other genres, but for the purposes of time, I'll just talk about these two today. One is confessional text, and the other is the creation narrative. So let's talk first about confessionals. So here's the title page of the Timucua confessional. It's published in 1613, and you can see that in Spanish it says confessional in the Spanish and Timucuan language, blah, 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 and then it says ordered by Padre Friar Francisco Pareja, and then it says that he's the father of the Custodia of Santa Elena de la Florida, and published in Mexico City in 1613. So there are a lot of documents like this produced during the Spanish colonial period, but a question for you is, who actually wrote this? Okay. Well, we've got the father, Francisco Pareja's name on the title page, but did he actually write all of this, both the Spanish side and the Timucua side? Or did he have various kinds of native people who worked with him to produce this document? Well, I'm kind of giving the answer away a little bit, probably. That it's pretty clear to us that there were native literate speakers of Timucua who assisted in the production of these materials, because often what the Timucua side says is different and reflects a native perspective. So we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. I think I'll skip this for things. But just in terms of native authorship, I mentioned already the differences, discrepancies in the meaning of the Spanish and the Timucua, but I'll also say that there are different dialects of Timucua represented in these books, and it's not very likely that Father Pareja translated the 1612 catechism in one dialect but chose a different dialect for the 1613 Confessionario. So I think these different dialects reflect the dialects of the native authors. Okay. So let's look at what a page in the Confessionario looks like. Here you can see a sample page. We've got this woodcut up here at the top left. So I always ask students, what's going on in this picture? Can anybody tell me? There's a confessional. So who are the figures here? Like, who is this person? This is the priest. Who is this? That's the confessant. And behind the confessant is the devil, and behind the priest is an angel, right? It's kind of nice, yeah? And then you can see on the left is the Spanish question. The first one says, did you confess the last Lent, Quaresma? And then on the right is the Timucua translation of that. And when they're paired up side by side like this, you think, oh, this is not so hard. Here's the Spanish, here's the Timucua. One is a translation of it. I'll be able to solve this right away. But when you get into it, you quickly realize not everything is as simple as this. Some pages are completely more complex than this, and they often end up saying slightly different things. One part of this confessional that's particularly interesting is the part shown here. So here you can see that in Spanish it says, ceremonios, agüeros y supersticiones que aún usan algunos, which means ceremonies, omens, and superstitions that some still practice. Okay. And then this is followed by several dozen pages of questions about traditional Timucua beliefs and practices. And this is where we find some of the most fascinating discrepancies between the Spanish and the Timucua. So sometimes the two sides just say different things. So just to orient you to the way the slide is laid out. So this is what's published in the book in the Timucua side, and this is what's published on the Spanish side. And then I've given you the translation of the Timucua and the translation of the Spanish. So this question in Spanish, I'll start with Timucua. The Timucua question says, did you say and believe that when animals are killed, the bones must not be thrown away or they would not enter the trap? Whereas the Spanish says, did you say that the bones of the game must not be thrown away, that the game would no longer enter into the snare or trap, but they must be hung up or placed on the palms of the house? So very weirdly, the Spanish side adds this detail about the bones of the game being hung up or placed on the palms of the house, but no mention of that at all on the Timucua side. Why, if one is supposedly the translation of the other? So different content sometimes. Here's another one. Here the Timucua says, names different kinds of birds. So did you believe that when an owl, the kind called atofo, or the kind of owl called hitikiri, or the kind of owl called hororo, or the kind of owl called asakama, or another bird sings, that its singing is a sign? Okay. So here, notice that Timucua mentions 4 different kinds of owls as well as any other bird. The Spanish, however, just says, have you regarded it as an omen or considered it a bad sign when the owl or barn owl sings? So notice here that the native author knows the names of 4 different kinds of owls and lists them all, whereas the poor Spanish only know 2 names for owl. They do the best they can. But of course, the native person knows that environment better. right? And is able to name all these species in a way that the Spaniard cannot. We also get cases where there are different euphemisms. So the Spanish sometimes is completely perplexing. So this question puzzled us for a long time. Being in your period or in your custom, have you walked with someone? What does that mean in Spanish anyway? It's an extremely euphemistic way of saying the same thing that Timucua says, were you penetrated by a man while menstruating? So you can see that the Timucua is sometimes extremely direct in getting straight to the point of the question, whereas the Spanish does kind of a little euphemistic trot around the matter. We also find a frequent pattern where some traditional practice is mentioned, and in the Spanish, it's referred to as evil or the demons ceremony, something like that, and that's often missing on the Timucua side. So here the Timucua side says, did you believe taking horns and praying, I will see the deer, and by doing this I will pray and kill it? The Spanish says, in order to hunt some deer, did you take the antlers of another deer and pray over them the demon ceremony? Okay. So notice that the Spaniards condemn it as the demon ceremony, and that's just omitted from the Timucua side. Okay. I think maybe just one more to give you a sense. So here's the Timucua side says, when the heavens spoke, which means thunder, when it thundered, did you blow and pray to extinguish it? And the Spanish says, thundering have you blown towards the heavens in order to stop the clouds or water with your evil prayers. Okay. Once again, different evaluation as well as different content. Okay. So some lessons from this confessional. This turns out to be the best available source for traditional Timucua beliefs and practices. It's been cited dozens of times in works that discuss Timucua history and culture. Like pretty much any dissertation or thesis on Timucua cites this, but only in the Spanish translation, right? Up until now, we haven't been able to read the Timucua side, so we haven't known what the native version of it says. But when we can read that, that gives a rather different picture of how traditional beliefs and practices operated. In terms of future plans, because the confessional is such an important text for understanding Timucua culture, we need a new translation that focuses on the Timucua language version. So Alejandro Dubkovsky and I are currently in the midst of editing a new translation, which we're tentatively calling When the Sky Speaks and the Body Trembles, Timucua Spiritual Practices in Colonial Florida. That book is going to include essays by our team of linguists, anthropologists, and historians. One of our co-authors is here with us today, and we're looking forward to publishing that with the University of Florida Press, likely in 2026. Okay, so that was the confession narratives and question, what do they tell us? Then I'll look at a different type of Timucua text. These are creation narratives. And here I want to look at the problem of bossy women in Florida, and also the problems of local knowledge. So first, bossy women. Okay. So let me ask you a question. I doubt you've ever really thought about this, but in the biblical story of Adam and Eve, Eve is tempted to take this apple, right, by the serpent. So she gets the apple. Why does she eat it all by herself? Why doesn't she say, hey, Adam, come over here, we've got some nice fruit to share? Okay? Why does she eat it first? So the Spanish version of the 1627 Catechism explains it this way. Moises Barcephas, who was a religious authority at the time, he asked why after Eve had taken the apple to eat, she did not go to her husband before tasting it and give him some food, why she ate it first without communicating with Adam. She opened her mouth and ate it up. To which he responds in the first book of Paradise that when the demon had promised that eating the fruit would cause one to be like God, she loved herself more than her husband or anyone else and wanted to be first, like God, and didn't want him to be. And so in order to be superior to her husband, she ate it. This left women with the desire to be the bosses, as I saw in Florida, as I still see in Florida, for example, in sending word to their husbands to not return to the house and never return again. And thus it was extremely hard to figure out their divorces and weddings, since for them, he brings firewood and leaves it at the door of the house. She makes the bed with palmetto and other things that they have left. And I happened to see a man who had 9 women living and far off, some of them accommodated and married by the church, etc. Eve wanted to be a god before her husband, and here she left women the great haughtiness of wanting always to be served and is admired as men, discontented and proud and ferocious as beasts. Okay. So that's the Spanish take on Eve and the apple. The Timucua version is a little different. So here's just my translation into English. So after saying this, one should consider why Eve took and ate that food without calling her husband and saying, let's eat. Because the devil's words were, after y'all eat, you will be gods. And wanting to be a god without delay, she forgot the one that she always loved, her husband. And without loving him, she thought, if I give it to him after I eat it, I will be a woman paracusi, which is an important political office for Timucuas, usually translated war chief. If I eat the apple first, I'll be like a war chief, knowing all things. My heart wants this. But if Adam, my husband, is a strong man, a king, a chief, then I will serve him. Thinking, I will not waste time and I want to be the boss of my husband, she took it and ate it. And because of this sin, even other women are proud and want to be rich and are haughty and full of rage and ferocious and discourteous. And these rude women are proud. Yeah, good for her. So what we're seeing here is a real source of discomfort in colonial Florida having to do with gender roles. So Timucua lived in a matrilineal and matrilocal society. So clan membership was calculated through the mother's line. And when man and woman married, the man went and lived in the woman's house, right? So women had a lot of power. They could be chiefs and other leaders in the society. But the Spanish were confused and discomforted by the elevated position of women in Timucua society, and often asked, why are these women so bossy? And the Timucua Eve story gives a reason for this, couched in the story of Eve and the apple. And it's notable that in this passage, the Spanish and the Timucua say really quite different things. There's no sense in which one text is the translation of the other. The passage in the two languages almost certainly have different authors. They share a certain amount of content, but at the language level, they're quite different and have different authors. So for much more on Native women in the early South, I would recommend this book by my co-author, Alejandra Dubkovsky. It's called Talking Back, Native Women and the Making of the Early South. The Timucua Eve story plays a key role in her book in introducing the discrepancies between Native and Spanish gender roles. And Alejandra, as I said, is my co-author. She's one of the chief people who helps me understand the historical context that these materials were produced in. And collaboration between a linguist and a historian is a powerful thing. Okay, so that is bossy women. Now I want to talk to you about creation and some problems with creation. So there is a long account of creation in the 1627 Catechism. Here I've given you an image of the page as printed, and I know that you can't read most of this, but if you look at the image, you can see at the beginning there's Spanish text in italics, right? And that is about 5 lines long, or 4.5 lines long. And then the Timucua version is all of the stuff beneath it, plus all of this stuff on the next page. So you see that sometimes in these texts, the Spanish is just a suggestion. And it often ends with etc. And then the Timucua goes on and on for pages after that. So this particular one, here's what the Spanish says. On the 5th day, which is Thursday, to adorn the earth, God created on it the seas, rivers, and lakes, and in these waters he created a great number of fish, and he made man the cacique or master of them, and he gave the wisdom to fish them. And that's all the Spanish says. all it says. As I showed you before, the Timucua goes on and on, but what does it say? So here's my translation of this. On the 5th, the day called Thursday, one must understand that God, Utina, made the seas, the rivers, the lakes, and the air to wash and adorn the earth, and so that one could farm it. Why did he make them? He provided them for us, and he made each fish in the water, the whale, the siacato, the alligator, the chayo, the acuatiro or cunachua, the chayo, the abai, the corvino, the tanito, the mullet, and the toco. Okay. So some of the words on there you know and some you don't, right? What we have here in the red in Timucua is a long list of things that live in the water. Okay. And so the puzzle is how to figure out what this all means. What do these things mean? So I told you before that Pareja wrote this arte, like a little grammar, and luckily he includes 4 words for sea creatures in it. We know the words for whale, mullet, corvina, and alligator. Okay? And because we know some of the words in the list, we can sort of anchor our understanding of what's going on at this point in the text. So the structure is something like this. The first word is uchu, and ko is a suffix that means and, right? So uchu and this other thing and an alligator and so, right? So what we're seeing then is that these missing ones, siacato, chayo, acuatiro or cunachua, chayo, etc., these are names of other species of things that live in the water. Okay. Right. So the list continues. It says he also gave us the puelo, the huacape, the henoso, the tume, the chapo, the sucusi, all the little fish and all the shellfish to be eaten he caused completely. They are brought as his blessing, the things which he wanted his sons to have, he said, and they existed. Okay. So trying to work out the logic of this text, there's an interesting kind of hierarchy here. So we start off with whales. The first thing on our list is the whale, right here. Okay. And then the last thing on the list is shellfish. And if you think about where these things are in terms of the environment, we start with species that are partly in the water and partly in the air, right? Because whales and some other species, part of their body is under the water, and from time to time, part of their body is above the water, right? So you start at the top of the water, the surface of the water, and then you work down to the shellfish that are stuck to the bottom. Right? So then the first few species, whale, siacato, and alligator, whale and alligator both have the common feature of being partly above and partly below the water, right? And that makes us think that siacato is another species that has that kind of profile, partly above and partly below. And then other things in here we can also figure out. One of the things in there says acuatiro el cunachua. So L is an old abbreviation that means or. It comes from a Latin word. So aguatiro, agua is water, and tiro is a Spanish word for salamander. I think that aguatiro is the Spanish word, and cunachua is the Timucua word. And then the Timucua word is made up of 2 parts. Cuna means neck, and chua means whole. And so I think it's likely that the animal in question is the amphiuma. So here's a little picture of one. Look at this kind of hole in its neck. I think that's why it's called cunachua, a whole neck animal. And there's another item on this list, abai. So we know that abai were traditionally venerated by Timucua people because in a different portion of this 1627 catechism, the text says, the moon is Utina. Utina, by the way, means worthy of veneration. So the moon is worthy of veneration, and therefore they worship it, they say. The idol, the fish, the abai are all gods, they believe. They say that there should be ceremonies, and they say that an animal should be venerated. And since fish and abai are listed separately on this, we think that abai is not a kind of fish. Likely logic to this gives us some possibilities for what siakato and abai and chayo might mean. Probably something like manatee, dolphin, shark. We have to work out which goes with which. But manatees and dolphins in particular have some human-like features that might make them likely objects of devotion or veneration. And they seem the likeliest candidates for abai. Okay, and here's a little diagram of the air and the water. So at the top, the things that are partly in the air and partly in the water, the whale and the siakato and the alligator, then things that are mostly underwater, and then finally at the very bottom, the shellfish. I think just in terms of keeping on time, maybe I'll move from this example with the species and talk to you about one other fun thing from the creation story, which is that here we also have a description of all the different ways that people catch fish. So a list of different kinds of fishing technologies. There's a word for fishing with a net, catching one at a time by fishing with a spear or a gig, putting up fish weirs, making fish traps, or something called a eufere. So we wonder, or you might ask yourself, the native author knows the names of all these things, all the different ways to fish, all the different species. Is the Franciscan priest likely to know all of those? Probably not, right? So here we see a nice sort of collaboration between a native author as well as the various Franciscans who organized this book. Okay, so a question that I've asked is, how is this list of animals compiled? Does it represent the knowledge of a single individual? Or is it represent an attempt to combine the knowledge of multiple individuals? The book was written primarily around Jacksonville at a mission there, but there were probably Timucuas from a wide range of places, both coastal and inland Timucuas, and it might very well be that this is not the local knowledge of any one Timucua writer, but it is a compilation of knowledge from a lot of different people. And I won't show you today, but when we look at a list of land animals, we also see both foreign and local species. So we see things like bear and snake, but we also see elephant and rhinoceros, right, in their catalog of all the different animals created by God at the beginning of the world. And so more broadly, you could say that this part of the 1627 Catechism is an example of a genre, medieval genre of literature called hexameral literature. So hexameral means the 6 days, referring to the 6 days in which God created the earth. And there's a large genre of manuscripts that go into detail about every part of the creation, all of the details of it. And it's an early example of the impulse towards encyclopedic knowledge. In the European context, these kind of commentaries often overlapped with early attempts to make encyclopedias, like that of Vincent de Beauvais, and Bartholomew the Englishman. But the one that's most relevant for the New World is the Franciscan Bernardino de Sahagún, who directed a group of Nahuatl speakers in writing the Florentine Codex, which is like an encyclopedia of the Aztec world. And here's an image from that page. Now, the Florentine Codex is really mind-blowing in its richness and depth. And I don't want to claim that what we see in the Timucua text is anything like that level of depth. Nevertheless, the impulse towards classifying animals, listing all of the ones you can think of and organizing them in some way is a universal human property. So the linguist Otto Jesperson wrote, "Man is a classifying animal." That's true whether man is in Europe or man is a native person in Florida. So this tendency to classify, organize, and create a hierarchy, I think, is a universal tendency in human thought. Written encyclopedias in this light are an attempt to make an implicit classification of the world explicit and available to others. And reading the Timucua creation story gives us insight into a native classification of the world. So just a few conclusions. The Timucua language can now mostly be read, and native language texts from early Florida are accessible to us in a new way. Reading these native texts has great potential to expand our knowledge of the indigenous history of our area and its interactions with the Spanish Church and the Spanish Empire. There's also a great opportunity to connect the contents of Timucua text with possible descendants among Seminole people today. And we can honor the original inhabitants of this land with careful and respectful study of the text that they produced. Thank you very much. And we have time for some questions and answers. I believe we have some microphones if anybody would like to ask. I can hear you. I think there are some people on Zoom. Hey, I can. Yeah. Okay, yeah.
You talked about creation text and confessional text. What are the other series of texts that you?
Yeah, you know, there's another really interesting set of what I call miracle stories. So these are where something. These texts originally come from Europe. The nucleus of them comes from Europe. Happens in a miraculous intercession from the Virgin Mary or a saint or something like that. And these are quite interesting, intricate stories with a lot of episodes and people arguing back and forth and conversation. These are pretty fascinating. And I've spent a lot of time working on them because linguistically they're quite great because we have little bits of conversation in them. Yeah, absolutely. So my colleague Alejandra and I have published a translation of one of these. I'll send you the link, and then I'd be happy to share some other ones with you. Yeah, really.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I have two questions. One is real simple, and there's no background. So the question is whether, you know, I'm actually familiar with this, with the connection there might be between Timucua and the Arawak language group of the Caribbean. I'm wondering if there is any overlap that you could find in perhaps those who continue to speak Arawak, maybe some of the residual legacies of Arawak or Timucua in Arawak in the Caribbean. And then the second question is backed by the sort of reality that in the last few years in colonial Latin American history, a lot of historians have been looking at translators and those translations that similarly, although, you know, a couple centuries later, for instance, Jesuit priests who would go on board slave ships, and they would bring translators who were themselves enslaved sometimes, but had come from the same region as the slaves who had just arrived. And there is an argument about the intentionality of those who were doing the translations in attempting to mediate either the intentions or the agendas, is a better word, of the Europeans, or simply explain them to those who are traumatized and are in this situation that is inexplicable to them otherwise. And I mean, there are many other examples besides that. There are many different new books about this. So I wonder, you know, one of the things they say, or these historians are, is that the translators had a certain degree of knowledge about Catholicism and then internalized and reinterpreted it in order to address the conditions that they were then mediating. So what do you know about the degree to which these writers might have had their own, version of Catholicism or interpretation that they were then, expressing in this different and perhaps intentionally different way?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thank you. So I'll answer the second one first, which is in the early stages, probably the number of Timucua who converted to Christianity was relatively small. And the literacy was taught in schools run by the Franciscans. So by necessity, pretty much everybody who was literate in the language in the early period was in one of these Catholic schools. So we think that likely candidates for the translators are probably Timucua young people who had gone to the school and then converted to Christianity. However, one important thing I think to remember is there are probably a small minority of Timucua-speaking people. So when they're asked to translate a text, I think they often find themselves in the mediating position of trying to explain Catholicism to other Timucua speakers in a way that's not insulting or offensive to them. I think that's probably why they take out things like, did you perform the demon ceremony? Did you do the evil deed of such and such? So that all gets kind of watered out. And then at other points, they have interesting explanations of Catholicism and Catholic customs that I think are geared towards being better understood by their by fellow members of the Timucua-speaking community. In terms of the first question, like connections to other languages, linguists are difficult to convince about these kinds of things. So it typically takes decades probably to convince someone that language A is related to language B, right? So nobody has successfully connected Timucua to another language. There is an attempt to connect it to South American or Caribbean languages, which I think is pretty unsuccessful. I myself have made a few starts towards trying to draw connections between Timucua and Muskegean, because I think that the structure of Timucua and the structure of Muskegean show a lot of commonalities. So that would be my guess, but I won't claim that I have proved that that is true at this point. Yeah. Any questions? Yeah.
Good afternoon. First
Yeah.
off, thank you so much for your time. The presentation was quite impressive and interesting. I would love to learn, while you're dealing with these high volume data sets with the languages, are you incorporating any tool sets like artificial intelligence?
No, it would be good if I could get artificial intelligence to do something, but this is all my own intelligence instead of the artificial thing. Nevertheless, I would be really interested. I think that probably there are a lot of generalizations that you could get out of this corpus of data that an AI system could probably detect that is not obvious to a human reader of the text, right? In particular, often you find statistical patterns of the distribution, certain kind of elements in a language that's not obvious to a speaker. So I think maybe a next frontier of this kind of research would be interfacing more with computational linguistics. And we're in early stages of doing some linguistics department here and some students to see if there are some ways in which these computational techniques would be helpful to us in trying to get a deeper view into the grammar of this language.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Hi, thank you for your talk. This is really fascinating. I have a question as an ecologist, but somebody very interested in Joseph Campbell's writings and research about spirituality through the ages. Is there any chance that there are any translations or stories that refer to spiritual beliefs beyond demon ceremony, et cetera, of Timucua? I'm interested because I love the landscape here,
Yeah.
and I'd be fascinated with kind of a spiritual perception or spiritual perspective of Timucua, of the land or
Yeah.
animals.
No, it's a really good question. So often what we know about non-Christian beliefs in this part of the world is contained in something denouncing heresies of various kinds. So we get little bits of glimpses of parts of the corpus talk about heresies or heretical beliefs of Timucua people. And so they give us little glimmers of this, but we don't have anything like complete non-Christian creation story or something like that. For the native people just west of us, the Appalachee, we do have a pretty remarkable mythological text about the origins of the ball game and the creation of the earth. And that was recorded by a Spanish priest, in the interest of denouncing it as a heresy, but they did a good job of documenting exactly what the myth is. The Appalachee one?
Are you able to point us to where we might read that or find
Sure. Yes, so the Appalachee myth is by a Father Paiva, P-A-I-V-A. So if you just Google Appalachee Paiva ballgame text, I think it'll pop up for you. And then you can read the whole story of the Appalachee sort of myth of the creation of the world.
Thanks for a great talk. What do you make of the way that the languages seem to be bleeding into each other, like how we see cacique in the Spanish text and how we see bendición in the Timucua text? And does that say anything about this idea of like idiomatic translation?
That's a good question. So it's interesting that as you all know, the first Spanish contacts were in the Caribbean, and they picked up certain kinds of words like cacique from, I don't know which island, Taino maybe? Some native language of the Caribbean, and then they apply it here in Florida even though it's not appropriate or not native to Florida. And then at the same time, sometimes they use Timucua words in the Spanish discussion, sort of like borrowing the Timucua into the Spanish. I think what it's representing is some sort of gap, perceived gap in the possibilities of the Spanish language to express certain kind of cultural concepts. So cacique is a particular kind of political office that they needed a special word for. Another Timucua word that we see showing up in the Spanish text is the word yaba, and yaba is something like a conjurer, so a person who does a certain kind of ritual for healing or other kinds of good luck or something along those lines. So very often the Spanish call these persons either yaba or hechicero. Hechicero is like someone who casts spells or does witchcraft. But the fact that they kind of alternate between these two words in the Spanish text, I think indicates that in some way they were not comfortable with complete equality between the two. They recognized some difference between these roles, which is why they often refer to them as both of these things at the same time.
We have an online question that asks, do you know any indigenous names of the Gulf of Mexico or Atlantic Ocean?
Unfortunately, we do not very much. So the place names are a hard thing in Native American languages. Often they're recorded, but we don't know what they mean. Or sometimes even the people who live there didn't know what their place name meant, right? Like the people who live in Micanopy right now don't know what Micanopy means, probably, right? So we have a list of these place names, but often we do not know what language they come from and we don't know what they mean. So that's a bit of a frustration. Sometimes we can work it out, but often we cannot.
Question over here.
Okay.
The question I have is, when you had talked about the possibility of man being, inclined to understand creation, is it possible that, given the fact that these priests and Franciscans were looking to evangelize and catechize, that they were finding, because biblically it says that God asked Adam to name all the animals, and that was what the names were. So being just polite and finding a common place, speak to the people that are there, the natives, to ask them what they knew their names to be, to find a common ground, to kind of, say, hey, look, wait a minute, we're on this, same planet, same place. Let me, teach us what
Yeah.
you have called these animals.
Yeah, I
To
mean,
find,
it's-
to be
it's a
able to
good-
catechize
I mean,
them.
We don't really know exactly the complete circumstances in which the texts were written. But it is interesting that the Spanish text that's published next to it doesn't list all the species in Spanish, right? So that material is only available on the Timucua side, suggesting to me that that reflects a Timucua interest in categorizing the world that was different from the Spanish interest in introducing the text. But, like I said, who knows? Who knows? It's difficult. No one was taking minutes of those meetings back then. Yeah. Okay, yes, sir.
Did the Timucuans have any system of writing before the Spanish arrived?
No, there was no indigenous writing in North America north of Mexico prior to European contact. That is because to have a writing system, typically you need to have a highly stratified society where instead of everybody doing everything, like everybody gardens, everybody hunts, everybody builds a house, instead you have role specialization. So some people are hunting, some people have a specialized role of being a scribe or taking accounts or something like that. So only in big societies with that kind of specialization does writing emerge. It's only happened probably less than a dozen times in the history of the earth, and then it spreads to other places. So just because the Timucua Society or other North American societies presumably did not have enough role specialization to produce a class of scribes or scholars, we don't have any writing from this part of the world before the Spanish get here. But I will say the Maya have writing. They have a big, complicated society and invent their own writing, but not up here in Florida. Yes?
Hey, I have a couple questions that kind of go together. You said you were able to identify different dialects, and I wanted to know how many, and if you were able to tie the dialects to regions, so like a Mocama dialect versus a Potano dialect. And then also, since you've been able to identify different dialects, how many different authors have you been able to identify as well?
Yeah. So I think I can identify about 5 different dialects of Timucua as represented in the writing. So one caution, though, with respect to dialect is when I say dialect, I'm mostly talking about spelling a particular word in a different way. So I'll just give you a real simple example. There's a word beta, which means for or at or to or something like that. In one part of the Timucua-speaking world, that's just beta, and another part it's boeta with a little wa sound. So if you look at the text, some of them spell it B-E-T-A and some B-U-E-T-A. And you can find dozens of examples of words that differ in their spelling in that way. And so you can see that some texts have completely one dialect of that sort, and other texts have a different one, right? So those differences in the way that words are written, I think they reflect the fact that there was not a standard way of writing Timucua when the spelling system was first introduced. Every person wrote it the way it sounded to them, so it tends to reflect their dialects. It could also be, however, that it's not so much the dialect as spoken is different, it's just that people choose to write it in slightly different ways. So we know if we take 5 people here and ask them to write things out, they'll use words with different frequencies, right? So it could be that these are not really different dialects as we mean, but different idiolects or different writing dialects of the authors. So different people write the language in different ways. As your question, in terms of the geographic regions, like Mocamo, Potano, and so on, a small number of these we can link to geographic distinctions because 2 of the Timucua books that were published in 1635 come from the western region of Timucua, the area around the, between here and Tallahassee, near the Georgia border. The materials from those dialects have a handful of quite different and distinct ways of saying things that are different from the forms produced by Mokama speakers on the coast. So at that point, we can actually say, this is a feature of the Western dialect, this is a feature of the Eastern dialect. I think Anita had a question here. Somebody will bring her a mic.
Well, first of all, it's an honor to hear all this stuff put together once again.
Thank you, Anita.
We
Yeah.
have separated it into various aspects through time, and I think you're the only person who can put it all back together again for the Timucua. But I would like to mention another group and ask about that group, because you recall at the same time you were working with the Timucua, we were working with the Wale. And we were trying to line it up. We didn't have as extensive a project as yours, and I had to leave in the middle and do Africa instead,
Right.
which didn't help at all. But we really ought to put that all back together again, because they're all part and parcel of the same cultures and the variations that existed through time and space. I had to titter and Twitter and whatever we want to call those things, because every time we bring up the sex during menstruation and the blood and the evil stuff and the non-evil stuff there, that gets expanded upon only very little, and everybody, doesn't really want to talk about it. Although we got a lot of stuff on that, as a matter of fact, and it's not the kind of things you find typically in your ordinary anthropology book, because they were down at the bare bottom there and talking about, everything in terms of sexuality.
Right.
In Wale, for example, which of course we can translate into, Timucua as well. The question, it makes me want to come back into the field and, and do those things. And the question is, you have done so very much in putting this all together for one society. What's the best way, and what would you maybe want to be involved with in terms of adding these other groups, like the Wale is a good example. You saw where they are on the map, everybody, right? They're just right to the north there,
Right.
and closer to the water. They're literally upon each other. But they are different, and the differences might be peculiarly interesting, or they might be very mundane as societies vary through time. Any suggestions on how to make this more inclusive by including these different groups, and which ones would you look towards?
Yeah, I wish we had a big collection of Wale language materials, but unfortunately we have almost nothing in their language. Almost nothing, right? So for me as a linguistic anthropologist, I don't have anything to work with for this particular group. Just in terms of the general project of connecting language, anthropology, and history, I'm also involved in working groups like this on Zapotec for Mexico and Choctaw, where we try to connect historical documents with history, archaeology, and also with the indigenous community members who are interested in those materials. So in general, I've got a dedication to trying to do this kind of work. I'd be happy to do it for some other group in the Southeast if I had the language materials, but I got to have the language materials to work with myself.
Yeah, well, we'll get Fletcher to give you the language materials. He does have them.
Okay, that'd be great.
I know there's probably more questions, but we do have to call time. I do want you to remind you that there are books that Aaron has produced that are here for sale if you're interested. And I also want to remind you, please, he is one of our own, right? He's, you can talk to him like anytime, because he lives right here among us, right? So this was not your only question and answer session, all right? So, but thank you, Aaron, for a wonderful talk. Thank you. And thank you all for